Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Forget about Lara Croft. Forget about Nathan Drake. I'm here to tell you about the most important video game action-adventure hero of all time, and that is, of course, the iconic Pitfall Harry. Hi everybody, I'm Giovanni Colantonio. I am the senior gaming editor over at digitaltrends.com, and I also co-host Left Trigger, Right Trigger, which is a video game podcast where we talk about linguistics. Each episode we pick a topic, which is a single word, and we each bring forward a game that we think somehow relates to that topic, and we talk about it. But today, I'm here to talk to you about one of my favorite video games of all time, one that has stuck with me ever since I was a child, and that is Pitfall for the Atari 2600. Now, Pitfall is a really difficult game to explain the appeal of. If you go and look at it today, you might kind of say, this looks pretty simplistic. So to explain that, I want to take you back a little bit. When I was growing up, I had a couple of video game consoles. I had a Sega Genesis, which I used a lot to play Sonic the Hedgehog 2, mostly. I also had a PlayStation 1, which I used to play whatever janky 3D fighting game that my godmother picked up at a Walmart and just happened to give to me. But my most treasured video game console was actually an Atari 2600. It was my mother's from when she was growing up, and she passed it down to me, and I was obsessed with it. She gave me her console with a couple of controllers and a little box with a few games in it. Not too many, but enough to keep me occupied. That included the original Pac-Man, which I played a lot, a game that is not as good as Miss Pac-Man, and you probably have the wrong image in your mind when you think of what actual Pac-Man is. Also a game called Circus, a very strange game that I really enjoy, and also the completely unplayable Spider-Man game for the Atari 2600 that I still do not know how to play today. Now, I was obsessed with the 2600. All those other consoles I mentioned were actually in my basement downstairs, on the downstairs TV in my house. The 2600 was the only one that I actually put in my bedroom. It was on a TV in my bedroom, and every weekend I would kind of sit down with it right in front of the TV with that old joystick and dig into the same games over and over again. And the game that I came back to time and time again and still think about time and time again is Pitfall. So what is Pitfall? This is actually a game from Activision, believe it or not. The company that now you may know for getting bought by Microsoft and getting a lot of their staff gutted, way before those days of making Call of Duty. Activision was doing a lot of really early games for the Atari. Pitfall, I think, is its most successful, or at least its most impressive game. It is a game that was developed by David Crane and released in 1982. And while games like Mario kind of get the credit for creating the original platformer, or at least modernizing it and making what it is today, I kind of think Pitfall deserves a lot of that credit. Pitfall is a 2D side-scroller, or not exactly side-scroller because Atari games at the time couldn't actually scroll, but a screen-based platformer where you play as a little adventurer called Pitfall Harry, who walks through the jungle, goes through a bunch of obstacles, picks up treasure, a loop that probably sounds really familiar if you've played any action-adventure game today. If you've played something like Uncharted or Tomb Raider, this is kind of the proto-version of those games. The way that it works is you are going through different screens, and each one has a sort of interesting obstacle to it. So the most iconic one is you walk into a screen and there is a pond with 3 alligators that you have to platform over. There's another one where you can grab a vine and swing over a lake, like Tarzan. It's an incredibly thrilling thing to happen on the Atari. There's quicksand where you have to time your movement just right to get over it while it contracts and goes back down. Scorpions, all of these little interesting obstacles that you find as you go from screen to screen. Now, I love this game, and what might be surprising to hear is that I've barely actually seen much of it. I've probably only seen a handful of the opening screens of Pitfall, and most certainly have not seen most of the content that is in the game. So it might be surprising to hear me pick this game and to hear me praise it in the way that I'm about to. But that actually speaks to what I love about Pitfall, because even though I kept dying as a kid time and time again and would have to start again and go through the same screens, I always felt compelled to, and I always felt compelled to come back and do those alligator platforming puzzles again, to go over that vine again, over and over and over. And even as an adult, going back to it, I actually picked up the Atari 2600 Plus reproduction console. I took my old Atari cartridge, my old Pitfall cartridge, put it in there, and same thing. Just kind of went through it, got a few screens more, and died and started it over again, and was happy to do it. It's hard to explain why I love that process, but it goes back to something that I think is underrated about original Atari games and how they were built, especially ones like this that were very screen-based. So in Pitfall, you are dealing with one screen at a time. You walk in from the left side of a screen, the obstacle is in front of you, you need to get through it and get to the other side. So, you walk into a screen and the obstacle is the quicksand pit. How do you get through this? You have to learn how to do it, trial and error, figure out the right timing for it. Atari controls can be kind of finicky, so you have to kind of contend with that. And it turns into a thing where you have to really master a game inside and out. You need to master exactly how to beat each screen and how to do that consistently so you can continue to get forward and not waste lives going over the crocodile pit again and again and then having to start over. I love this kind of setup. And I imagine it's the appeal that a lot of people feel with Dark Souls games, and it is ridiculous to bring Dark Souls into it, but I'm doing it mostly as a bit. But when people talk about the thrill of a Dark Souls game and how, yes, bashing your head against a wall, against a boss for 3.5 hours is the thrill. You learn it inside and out, and by the end of it, you can beat it. That's kind of the appeal of a lot of early Atari games. They were about mastering one single obstacle one at a time, and by the end of it, you could kind of string together a perfect game. This is a really underrated way to make a game that I think has kind of fallen to the wayside as games have gotten more open-ended. Now it's more about having multiple ways to get across an obstacle, and maybe it's not about solving something so much as it is figuring out the way that you want to get around it. And that's great. Player agency is wonderful, and that is fantastic. But I love the sense of mastery that comes from this, where you can really perfectly learn a game. It's kind of the same thrill that I get from playing Donkey Kong. When you know how to do the first level of Donkey Kong perfectly, you can do it down to the millisecond, and there's a real mastery to that. If you want a modern example of a game that I think gets the appeal of Atari games really well, there's a game that came out this year called Animal Well that you might be aware of. It is a platformer that kind of feels like a maximalist Atari game at times, and it has a really similar screen-based setup to it, where you walk into a screen, there's kind of a set obstacle on that screen that you have to get past, and you have to kind of learn to master it to get through that world. You have very limited health in that game, so you really have to learn these things, or else you're going to kind of die and go back to the save point over and over again. That game really gets the appeal of something like Pitfall and feels almost like a spiritual cousin to it in some sense. I love that about it. I really do. And speaking of games that this is really influenced, I mentioned games like Tomb Raider earlier. I mentioned games like Uncharted, and I want to go back to those because I think you can obviously draw a really clear line between Pitfall and Uncharted. They kind of feel like the same game, right? Pitfall Harry and Nathan Drake aren't too different of characters, right? They're guys running through the jungle and moving on vines and collecting treasure. It's kind of the same idea, but, one has many, many millions of dollars more behind it and more content behind it. And that's something I want to talk about, which is the thing that is so great about Pitfall is that it's so sleek and there's no fat on it. And every bit of it matters. Every screen of it feels like an important obstacle, and it doesn't really feel like you're repeating something over and over again for the sake of time. I mean, Atari games were not meant to be long experiences. They were meant to be short, but what made them long was the fact that you had to master them. You had to play them over and over again until you got them right, until you figured out the crocodile pit, which is still really difficult to figure out even to this day for me. There was just no fat on these games. And when you look at something like Uncharted, a game that has taken the idea of Pitfall and blown it up to an unimaginable proportion, it's impressive and it's incredible, and the spectacle that's in that game is wonderful. But at the same time, it also achieves that through a lot of repetition, right? Like, if you've played an Uncharted game, you know that there's like 100 scenes in every game where Nathan Drake runs and tries to grab a cliff and just almost misses, but he grabs the edge and kind of pulls himself back up. They do that over and over again. That's something that Naughty Dog especially loves to do as a studio. You may recognize in a game like The Last of Us, there's a sequence that will happen over and over again where you're walking on a bridge to get somewhere, and then the bridge collapses, and now you have to do a detour. The more games kind of try to get longer and bigger, what ends up happening, I find, is that they kind of repeat beats over and over, and they kind of lose their specialness after a while. And again, in going back to something like Uncharted, that ledge climb moment where the tension of almost missing the ledge and grabbing it gets really boring after a while, at least for me, or it at least gets, predictable after a while. Okay, there's a gap happening here. I can see that it's a little far. I know exactly what's going to happen. They're going to use the same point of tension over and over again. But also, you kind of have to do that if you're making a game to the size of Uncharted. It needs to kind of cross a certain length threshold or to justify its price tag to a lot of consumers. You kind of need to just... If you're spending millions of dollars to build something like the fun ledge climb animation, you probably want to get more out of it than one scene, And so you kind of end up with a lot of recycling of content that happens in those games to make them appear bigger than they are, which is fine, and those games are fantastic. Uncharted 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. But Pitfall is so special because it doesn't repeat beats, or at least not nearly as much. The swinging across a vine feels special because it only happens a few times, or the crocodiles feel special because it only happens a few times, or the scorpion, things like this. They feel like bespoke obstacles, even though they do kind of come back, later in the game and in different screens. And that kind of makes it exciting. It makes those feel like special moments when they happen and not like a mechanical thing that is going to come back and you're going to have to deal with over and over again, and you're going to have to learn how to master once, but then once you've mastered it once, you just have to do it again. It's not constant skill checks. It's always a new thing that you're kind of learning. And for me, that's just such a fantastic way to make a game that I think is hard nowadays, when the scope of games is much bigger, when the expectation of what is in a game is much bigger. It's hard to do that. But if I'm being honest, when I play Pitfall, I feel the same level of excitement and engagement as I do Uncharted 4. Obviously, that game might have more narrative trappings, and it might have flashier graphics, and it might have some more engaging puzzles and whatnot. But the core experience of just exploring and moving on a vine over a lake or something like that is kind of the same to me. I think you can kind of feel the heart of gaming in a lot of Atari games, and you can feel that minimalistic core of them, the kind of primal joy of just moving across a screen and going across an obstacle. And I don't think you really need flashy graphics to do that. I think that's kind of become a crutch to make things that are already spectacular seem more spectacular. And I think Pitfall is a game that proves that video games are spectacular on their own, whether or not they're realistic or whether or not they are as few bits and colors as you could possibly put onto a screen. That's what makes this game special to me. If you've never had a chance to play Pitfall, I really recommend it. Whether you find an emulator, play it online, what have you, it's a really special game, especially if you go into it with these ideas in mind, of what it does in a sort of minimalistic way that is still done today in gaming, but maybe with a lot more special, flashy trappings around them. A fantastic game, one that I hope that we don't end up seeing Xbox, now that it owns Activision, turn into basically its version of Uncharted. But who knows? I don't even know if Activision has the rights to this game anymore. Video game rights are weird, folks. They just kind of go around wherever they feel like. But please, if you ever get a chance, bring back Pitfall so that we can bring back Pitfall Harry and give him the place in the Video Game Hall of Fame that he rightfully deserves. That's all I got. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Giovanni Colantonio. Like I said, you can read my writing about video games over Digital Trends. You can listen to me talk about video games on Left Trigger, Right Trigger, wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can find me on Twitter or Blue Sky, whatnot, at Mario Prime. Thank you so much for listening, and happy gaming.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
and Jacob McCourt.
With many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. All with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers
and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.